Welcome everyone to today's virtual briefing hosted by the Natural Security Campaign, a collaboration of 4 leading conservation organizations. This is the second of our series of 3 that will culminate next week. Today we'll be exploring community-based wildlife conservation, the role of ecotourism, and the impacts of COVID-19. My name is David Wilkie. I'm the Executive Director of Rights and Communities at the Wildlife Conservation Society. I work with our field programs to support the efforts of 205 Indigenous peoples in 39 countries to secure and exercise their traditional rights. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term natural security, let me provide a brief explanation. We all know that the world is less safe when bad actors clear forests, pollute streams, poach wildlife, and steal fish that do not belong to them. Because of their actions, the biological diversity and health of the planet suffers. This in turn causes millions of people to be deprived of basic necessities, foments conflict, forces migration, and spreads insecurity. When I think of natural security, it reminds me of 3 stones in a cooking fire, where security, conservation, and human well-being are the essential stones that keep the pot from falling over and spilling its contents. We have seen that targeted US investment in international conservation, global health, and food security, the 3 stones of the cooking fire, contributes to America's long-term foreign policy objectives and enhances US economic and national security interests around the globe. For me, when natural security enhances global well-being, it strengthens US national security. The concept of the 3-legged stool or 3-stone cooking fire is not new in community-based conservation. I led a US-supported program named TransLinks that integrated effective governance, economic development, and nature conservation. We learned that diversified rural economies are much more resilient to environmental, market, and health shocks, and that communities need the timely, competent, and trusted support of national agencies to reinforce their capacity to stop bad actors from stealing their natural resources. We also learned how environmental health and human health are deeply connected, something that SARS and MERS and now COVID are confirming. As you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has infected millions, killed hundreds of thousands, left survivors with what may be long-term neurological and cardiac problems. It's also shuttered and shattered economies, thrown vast numbers of people out of work, plunged untold families into poverty, homelessness, and food insecurity. And we'll likely see additional waves of the disease crash across the planet until an effective vaccine is available. As you will see today, the pandemic also has profound implications for community-based conservation. Today's presentations will give us a live look into ongoing conservation efforts in Namibia and Kenya, and help us better understand the impact that COVID-19 is and will have on the communities themselves and the conservancies they manage. Community-run conservancies have been supported by the US government for decades. They have been measurably successful. They have led to recovering wildlife populations, economic growth and opportunities, strengthened rural governance, and higher standards of living. To me, most importantly, they've empowered women and youth to become agents of change in their communities and countries. We will follow the presentations with a live Q&A. You should see a box to submit your questions directly below the video player, and we encourage you to do so. You can also email questions to info@naturalsecurity.us. I'm delighted to be joined today by 4 fantastic panelists from World Wildlife Fund, Namibia's oldest conservation NGO, Integrated Rural Development and Natural Conservation, the Northern Rangelands Trust in Kenya, and Conservation International. Each of them will take a deep dive into the subject. First, I'm going to turn it over to Basilia Shivute and Chris Weaver. Basilia joined IRDNC in 2013 as an operations manager, but she has more than 17 years of experience in sustainable tourism, environmental consulting, and community-based conservation practice. Chris has been director of WWF's Namibia's program since 1993, providing guidance and assistance to Namibian partner organizations in the development of one of the world's most highly regarded community conservation programs. Today, they'll provide a high-level overview of how the conservancy idea came about in Namibia, how it works, and how it has served as a really effective model for efforts in other countries. Basilia and Chris, please take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. Greetings from Namibia, a slightly bigger country, a country slightly bigger than Texas, that only gained its independence in 1990. Why are we talking about community conservation? Since we only gained independence in 1990, before independence, during the apartheid South African regime, the whole conservation sphere in Namibia was government-led, and the community had no ownership over their resources. The whole system did assume that obviously communities were the problem because the whole thing was more military style. This obviously led to communities feeling that they are basically withdrawn from the whole conservation aspects, and also feeling withdrawn from the whole thing. This obviously led to poaching for key species such as elephants and rhinos. I, for example, grew up just 2 hours drive north of Etosha National Park, but I never had any connection with the park, nor did my parents also have any connection to the park. Moving on.
I'll take it from here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of the U.S. government in supporting the Namibia CBNRM program. The U.S. government has been intimately involved in changing the paradigm from a fortress conservation approach to a participatory inclusive approach. Since 1992, Namibia has received a string of support from the U.S. government, including the LIFE program from 1992 to 2008. That was followed by the Millennium Challenge Corporation investment that went from 2011 to 2014. And more recently, with the advent of wildlife crime, we've been the recipients of 3 INL projects from 2016 to current day, and also a regional combating wildlife crime project by USAID. We've received about $131 million in support from the US government. And the US government not only put its money forward, but it puts forth its best expertise. As you see, the ambassador of Namibia walking and leading the Rhino Pride campaign last year. Moving ahead.
Different funding sources, as Chris mentioned, enable the success of Namibia's community conservation. In 1998, and that's after independence, communities were given the rights to have ownership, to manage their own resources. That also then enabled them to derive economic benefits from their wildlife or natural resources through tourism or other use. One can see the landscape, how the land has changed between 1998 and 2019. It led to the fact that now we have about 86 communal registered conservancies benefiting about 200,000 people in Namibia. The whole thing of giving rights to communities was not only over wildlife, it was also seen an issue to readdress the social and the racial injustice created during the apartheid era. Moving ahead, Namibia now have about 44% of Namibia's land is under conservation. So Namibia's national achievement in community conservation as a result of communities now having the rights to benefits from tourism resulted in a number of joint venture partnerships between communities and investors in tourism, and that have increased as demonstrated here. Total benefits to communities have also increased over the years as demonstrated by the graphs, as well as the number of conservancy with cash benefits. that have enabled them to receive some money to empower their lives and livelihood have also increased. Moving ahead, obviously, in addition to the cash income that is derived from tourism, has also enabled these communities to be developed. For example, there has been improvements in local schools and clinics. The vehicle for the conservancies suddenly now are the ambulance for those injured or ill. Infrastructure development for human-wildlife conflict mitigation has been enabled, and as well as enabling communities to have access to water supply for those communities that never had them before. All this because of the rights for them to benefit from tourism. Moving ahead, in addition to the wildlife, income from wildlife, we have also seen successes in terms of recoveries of wildlife in conservancies. For example, elephant have more than doubled between 1995 and 2018. And Namibia today proud itself as one of the countries with the largest free roaming black rhino population in the world. And that's quite a big change if you compare to 1980, where it was almost extinct. Moving ahead as well, the whole thing of the community conservation has also enabled the strengthening governance and democracies in a local way. For example, we facilitate, but the communities are the one that guide us in terms of direction. The 86 communal conservancy that I spoke about, they are all democratically elected in terms of whoever is managing those conservancies. They are elected by their communities, and they represent at least one of every 11 Namibian citizens. And there has been a big drive, despite the cultural issues, there has been a big drive, and it has enabled a lot of women to be empowered, and also enabled local associations to at least be united and have one voice to lobby and advocate for conservation issues in Namibia, even for policy formulation. Moving ahead.
The conservancies have been fantastic in terms of creating a strong sense of ownership over wildlife, but they haven't been able to address the issue of organized crime as effectively as would be ideal. We had no poaching in Namibia from the late 1990s until around 2011. And then in December of 2011, we had our first 2 rhino poached in the conservancies. But notably, the poachers were apprehended within 24 hours. But this poaching that's taking place now is a lot different than the bushmeat trade and the old historical rhino poaching or elephant poaching that was taking place. This is actually organized crime. And organized crime is very sophisticated. What the conservancies have been able to do to counter this is that they've been able to build upon the pride that their membership have. And that pride is such that when they see outsiders coming into the area, people they don't know, people they suspect might be doing something up to wrong, they have an alert system that they follow. They contact their game guards, they contact their conservancy management committee, and they in turn contact law enforcement officials. And what we've seen over the last 4 years is about 12 cases where there have been preemptive arrests as poachers go to poach rhino in these conservancies in the northwest of Namibia. So the conservancies also, they're one part, the very critical part of the law enforcement chain. The conservancies are the eyes and the ears on the ground. And if the community is on your side, then you've dealt with 90% of the problem, and you only have to deal with the remaining 10%. Okay, so that's a huge plus. And the conservancies, with their income, they employ 680 community game guards. And these game guards they do more than game guarding. They do human-wildlife conflict, they monitor wildlife populations, they facilitate people with business operations with the hunting side of things. They're very multi-use, but one of the things they do very well is they identify when poaching incidents take place, they guard the scene of the crime, and they notify the law enforcement authorities so they can get there quickly. But that's the bottom link of the chain, and it doesn't work if you don't have the law enforcement authorities responding quickly and efficiently, building a good case, the prosecutors taking that and using intelligence-led investigations and prosecutions, and having a judiciary that's in tune with the impacts of serious wildlife crime on both the Namibian economy and its biodiversity assets. And so this has been a real challenge, is how you bring all these different links of the law enforcement chain together. But Namibia has done a remarkable job on doing that. And this is largely a result of the US government support. Namibia as well, through the years, it's gone and it's changed that paradigm from fortress conservation to highly participatory. There are standards and systems and tools applied all across Namibia's 86 conservancies, and it's become a model for conservation around the world. And in the case of this picture, this is a group of Mongolians that were learning about the Namibian experience from Namibians going to Mongolia. But also there's been a tremendous amount of exchange between Kenya and Namibia on the conservancies and learning and sharing from one another. And there's also been a lot of an exchange between the Northern Great Plains in the United States and Namibia, where the ranching community from the US has come across to learn how to incorporate wildlife and wildlife enterprises into livestock industry so that they can keep their children on the ranches as well, instead of just the lead rancher. Turning it back over to, okay. On the COVID-19, this has made a dramatic change. As Basilia was saying, Namibia is heavily dependent upon the tourism income. We have no tourism income this year. Not just in the conservancies, but across the country, the national parks, across the region. And this is a devastating impact in terms of conservation and the ability to support conservation. Basilia will tell you a little bit how it's affecting people at the community level.
Yeah, COVID obviously is 2020 caught us by surprise, and so we have been able to respond and be there for the communities in these bad times as well. So we have done that by raising awareness on the issue of COVID, how contracting COVID and how they can help themselves, or promoting hygiene, distributing local-based hygiene products to the communities, facilitating, basically helping the conservancies to readjust their budgets. Now, suddenly there's no income from tourism, they have to readjust their budget. And then also reassessing their financial shortfalls, as well as trying to facilitate JV agreements with the tourism partners to ensure that if they are not meeting obligations for the payments, the community is also understanding. COVID have really tested teachers a lesson, but it has also enabled us to stand with the communities in these bad times, and that it have re-emphasized that this relationship with the communities are really based on trust and mutual understanding and being there for each other. Thank you.
So thank you very much. We really appreciate the interest of the stakeholders in this meeting and learning about Namibia, and we really value the support the US government has given us through the years. Thank you.
Thank you, Basilia and Chris. That was a great example of how devolving rights to local communities has enormous impacts on wildlife conservation and community well-being. You know, the Namibian conservancies, I think, always taught me that when states do respect the rights of local communities, communities feel that that their natural resources are theirs and poaching is stealing from them. And as Chris and Basilia said, communities are highly motivated to be the eyes and ears to try and help the law enforcement agencies to combat illegal trade. But as Chris said, I think it's also really important to recognize that the important role that state arresting authorities have in this connection between conservancies and law enforcement. Thank you both very much. That was an excellent presentation. Next, I'd like to welcome Tom Lalampa, the Chief Executive Officer of the Northern Rangelands Trust. Tom has been a leader in the design, development, and expansion of the Trust, which now covers 35 community-owned and run conservancies and brings over 10 million acres of communal lands into active conservation management. Today, Tom will take us through the understanding of the Trust and its membership. He'll also really interestingly talk about how tourism in conservancies provides a vehicle for business development, helping to diversify and boost economies in some of Kenya's most marginalized areas. Tom, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kenya in East Africa. Conservancy movement is growing in Kenya, just as it is the case in other parts of Africa. We currently have about 160 conservancies in Kenya, 40 of which fall under the Northern Rangelands Trust, NRT, umbrella. Some of the key drivers for the growth of community-led and community-owned conservancies in Northern Kenya include one, peace and security. Number two, habitat loss, largely through degradation. Wildlife outside the protected areas, a situation where the local communities are hosting wildlife in their own land, knowing very well that about 65% of Kenya's wildlife are found outside protected areas. The fragile ecosystem around it, which is causing a bit of disconnection, over-extraction, weak governance in terms of lack of community strong institutions, poaching, fewer opportunities, and the whole idea around wildlife space and corridors. These were some of the key drivers that saw the growth of community conservancies in Northern Kenya. The community conservancies in Northern Kenya under the umbrella of the Northern Rangelands Trust are community-owned, community-led, with a very strong community decision-making structures, and the aspect of ownership is real on the ground. These community conservancies are community institutions with local boards, with the local staff that really ensure that we drive the impact from the ground. And so largely it's proven to be a local governance model that drives change, drives local economies, and really being a homegrown solution. And so with the growth of the Conservancy, there was clearly a vacuum of an organization, of an umbrella organization that will provide oversight, provide technical support, ensure best practices, and keeping conservation at a landscape. And this is how the Northern Rangelands Trust came to be, when those community conservancies, as early as we were starting, came together and formed this umbrella organization. And currently cover about 4.2 square kilometers, both terrestrial, marine, and forestry. Impact-wise, we're using a very multi-sectoral approach, working with these communities, and some of the few impacts include the fact that last year we did a survey and 88% of the community conservancy members believe that wildlife is important for their future. We've had a 96% drop or decline in the number of elephants killed for ivory in the conservancies since 2012. It was very interesting when the local elders and communities started branding poachers as those people who are stealing from their own community. By poaching an elephant, you are simply being selfish and you are stealing from your own community. Rangelands and forestry restoration is a big hit, it's a big success. Largely what we are seeing is that the community managed sanctuaries that target endangered species are proving to be very successful in contributing to the national recovery efforts for the endangered species. And these are largely around black rhino. Communities are now hosting the most endangered Hirola antelopes, the reticulated giraffes that are now on the hands of the local communities. The other impact we are seeing is the expansion of the wildlife range and increased connectivity, as these communities form a mosaic of connectivity in terms of range, in terms of opening up the space. There's also evidence of increasing population now on the community land, especially on elephants, grave zebra, reticulated giraffe, and Besa oryx on the community land. The other impact is really about witnessing for the first time community rescuing abandoned elephants and rewilding them and hosting them on their own land. We continue to see a lot of impact around improving the livelihoods of the local communities through the conservancies, and this touches a lot around water, education, and health. Largely, we continue to see improved local governance with women and youth now taking leadership positions on this conservancy movement. We continue through the conservancy model to register or witness improvement on the household level and the community level income, largely around enterprises such as beadworks that's done through these conservancies that targets women, vocational training that really targets our youth, livestock to markets targeting men, octopus in the marine targeting our women, and so far jobs created over 1,400, and financial assets for both. We have also continued to witness as an impact to this model, improving peace and security through purely dialogue and getting different ethnic groups to dialogue. Tourism development is really now on the right path, where communities are now seeing wildlife as a major economic for tourism, jobs. Just looking at the community model that we are working with our local communities, some of the opportunities that the model fails for us is the opportunity to improve local governance or natural capital. It's about local communities, it's about them doing it, dirtying their hands, but doing it themselves, and you see the pride in their faces. The second opportunity through this model is the opportunity to grow local talent for wildlife sector. Getting those village youth in the villages, in the rural villages, building that skill and leadership right from the grassroots. The third opportunity that this model brings is really around nature-based economic growth to diversify livelihoods of the local communities. The fourth opportunity really is around the rangeland management as the basis of wildlife conservation. It's becoming very critical, and the communities are now focusing more on healthy rangelands, healthy landscapes to support the same. The other opportunity this community fails is the public-private community partnership based on wildlife. It's a massive opportunity, and also the fact that this model provides an opportunity for internal best practices input to local conservation. The impact of the COVID has been such that we witnessed the poverty, really increase in poverty, interruption of the aid services, and government services being redirected, or government resources being redirected. Tourism continued in the past before COVID to create revenues for communities and create jobs, which has been amazing. But we've learned some lessons from COVID to diversify. Just to sum it up, I really want to thank the US government for many years of support, and also our US long-term partners, including the private, that have really invested into seeing this community conservancies manage their natural capital with very little support, and also through the technical support, the science that our US-based partners are also bringing for these communities. We measure impact a lot. We look at wildlife monitoring, we look at vegetation monitoring, we look at marine, we look at forestry, and we've developed all these tools to assess impact and do undertake surveys on an annual basis.
Tom, thank you very much for giving us insight into all of the broad range of positive outcomes that come from building conservancies in northern Kenya or across Kenya. I was particularly taken by the fact that you said, Tom, that local governance and wildlife management actually reduced inter-ethnic conflict. But I also think I remember hearing that devolving authority and creating conservancies also just increased security in general, reduced banditry along the roads. And so it is quite remarkable the range of positive outcomes that the conservancy movement has had in communities in Kenya. Again, thank you very much, Tom. Next, I'd like to welcome our final panelist before we go to questions and answers. Michael O'Brien Onyeka is the Senior Vice President for the Africa Division of Conservation International. He's leading a refreshed CI Africa strategy focused on sustaining the nature that Africans need to thrive. Today, he'll discuss how to drive sustainable development and how community conservation helps preserve natural capital. That's the forests, grasslands, fresh water, soil, and wildlife that its people rely on. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, and welcome, everyone. Very grateful for this opportunity. I have very few minutes, so I'm not going to bore you so much with all the nitty-gritty aspect of our strategy in Africa. I'm sure you don't want to hear, but I will just give broad strokes. So I'm very privileged to work, like the moderator said, with Conservation International, and I'm based here in Nairobi. My colleague, the last speaker, Tom, is a very close friend. We are working very closely with Tom's Northern Rangelands Trust, doing some of those great stuff he was explaining. So before I go into our strategy, you know, we all talk about Africa, and this is not official, neither the US government certified map of Africa. It's just you know, putting together to put it in perspective. We talk about Africa a lot, but Africa is a super complex continent. People joke about that Africa is not a country, and it's very true. It's a very huge continent. You can fit in a lot of other countries into here and still have space. And I just wanted to present that to give the magnitude of what we are dealing with in Africa. Apologies for the bit of sound. Is the challenge of working from home in the time of COVID. Africa also, from the major news outlets, you know, when you look at Africa, you're either hearing about great tourism or great upheavals, which are all true. But if you drill down a bit, yes, Africa has lots of challenges, but I describe it as a continent with high challenges and high optimism. Yes, you know, we have high population growth, which is not entirely bad, unless it's not managed very well. The population is currently at 2.2 billion and expected to continue to grow. You know, we have one of the fastest urbanization rates in the world, which hasn't unfortunately translated to great things, but can potentially. We have very poor soils, which have meant we have very unrealized agricultural potentials, and so on and so forth. Weak systems of governance, although that is improving, corruption, lack of transparency. There's so many challenges. But at the same time, Africa has great opportunities, has shown it can move when the stars are aligned. You know, we have one of the fastest growing middle class in the world, in spite of all the challenges. More than a dozen African countries are ahead of India on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. I was just looking at the 2018 global index on government efficiency, spending efficiency. And Rwanda, a country in Africa, was 5th globally, above Switzerland, above Canada, and I think also above the United States in governance spending expenditure efficiency. So there is lots of hope in Africa, and I also want to balance that. So in terms of the strategy of the Conservation International in Africa, we look at all these challenges and try to bring them together. What are the basic major challenges? We believe that when you consider nature and conservation, the current economic model has not really placed high premium on the value of nature. So that has naturally led to nations cashing in on their natural capital for short-term gains. And of course, this contributes to scarcity, depletion, and cyclical poverty. And what we want to do is to flip that on its head and push and ensure that nature is squarely inserted into national consciousness across the continent in development plans, in budgeting, and so on. Because once it becomes a critical component of a country's GDP and so on, then there might be more interest to protect these vast natural resources. And that by doing this, we'll end up protecting and sustaining all those key reservoirs of nature. So our mission is to restore and secure key reservoirs of nature across Africa, but not just for nature's sake. We want to place people at the middle, at the center of it. So these efforts must lead to increased resilience of communities and who are empowered to be active leaders in this conservation space. That in a nutshell is our mission. And you see that in our approach. We engage with communities, government, civil society, private sector. I said earlier, we do have a very long ongoing engagement, for example, with the Northern Rangelands Trust. That's just an example of the hundreds of different partners we work across 42 countries in Africa. Our target, because if you're doing something, you need to be very conscious of what your aims are. So at a minimum, we are aiming by 2030, hopefully before then, to secure or restore 5.4 million hectares of tropical forests, 25.2 million hectares of rangelands, and I will come to that in a minute, 46.8 million hectares of marine ecosystems across Africa. And once we do that, we hope that that will translate into tangible benefits for millions and millions of Africans in terms of improved livelihoods, improved food security, improved resilience to climate change, and of course, improve peace, safety, and security. Because without peace, safety, and security, we may not be able to do all the other stuff we want to do. So they are all integral. Just as we say natural capital, natural security can translate to good national security, is the same approach we are taking on the ground. So the key intervention areas quickly are in saving Africa's critically threatened tropical forests. We host in Africa the second largest tropical rainforest in the world, which is the Congo Basin. But there are other equally important forests across the continent. So we want to save those key ecosystems across the continent by introducing several interventions. And I'm not gonna go into details of that right now, but during the Q&A, if people want to know more. We are also working on securing Africa's degraded rangeland. Now, rangelands are super important in Africa. They cover 42 to 43% of the continent. These are the savannas, the some parts of the desert, arid and semi-arid areas, the grasslands, and so on. They are over 90% degraded. And we are working and focused on restoring these degraded lands and turning them into viable economic and livelihood landscapes. We're also working to unlock the social and economic values of ocean conservation at scale, including coastal conservation, including mangroves conservation. And of course, water, fresh water is a critical asset. Africa is one of the highest water stress regions of the world. So securing the few freshwater towers across Africa is a key component of what we do. We take these engagements to scale by utilizing various amplification platforms like the Gaborone Declaration for Sustainability in Africa, which is a 14-country initiative focused on working towards a green economy or economic development that works in consonance with nature and not against it, and several other partners. Through that, we are able to amplify the work we do across 42 African countries. I've been told my time is up, so I will stop there and say thank you. Asante sana, as we say in Kenya.
Thank you, Mike. That was another excellent presentation, and I really like to see that all of the presentations really were Africans driving a shift away from fortress conservation towards community-based conservation, where Indigenous peoples and local communities have formal rights to manage and benefit from their natural resources. That really is a marvelous shift that's happening in Africa over the last 20, 30 years. A big thanks to all the presenters today. We'll wrap things up today with questions and answers. Again, please feel free to use the question submission box below the video to ask any questions you may have. We'll do our best to get your questions today, and if needed, we'll follow up with attendees with more info via email after the event if we can't cover it all. So let's quickly think about some of the, I'm just checking to see what's come in from our participants. Here's one question. Maybe I can ask Tom if you could answer this. Is your sense in the Northern Rangelands Trust that poaching cases have increased during the pandemic? Is that something that you're seeing within your conservancy's movement in Kenya?
Thank you so much, David. Not quite. Where we've seen an increase was on bushmeat, down into the coastal part of the country. You know, very organized bushmeat with motorcycles and like 10 youths, 15 youths, and they started with the small animals like dik-diks, and then they graduated to giraffe. And so that was the main one. In terms of poaching, not quite. We have only had one case that was managed, because currently the communities volunteer the information of exactly who is involved. And so it didn't quite go high, but bushmeat for sure really went high.
So Tom, this is you think this is a result of food insecurity as a result of COVID?
A number of factors. One is that during the COVID, we had many youths at homes doing nothing, that have moved into the villages, and they no longer get those sort of casual jobs that they will make a living. And so largely that, and also secondly, lack of food. We know very well that most of the markets were closed down, and so really putting a food on the table during this COVID was really a big challenge. And so the youths were probably getting out of homes to go and hunt just to put food on the table.
No, very interesting. A combination of unemployment and food security. Mike, you have a comment?
Yes, if I may come in support of what Tom said, I just want us to be careful about making the distinction between poaching as the world knows it, which is the large-scale commercial level led by organized criminal gangs that go and kill wildlife purely for commercial purposes to make money, versus what I would call artisanal harvesting of wildlife out of desperation in some cases because of lost livelihood systems. Like Tom said, people are at home, there are no jobs. There are communities that are 100% reliant on tourism revenue, and with the global lockdown, they're recording zero revenue. And so these are desperate actions, as much as they are illegal, but I want us to make that distinction between that. I wouldn't want anyone to think African communities are now heavily involved in poaching. No, the part of the reason people can still come from around the world and see wildlife in Africa is because historically African communities have always lived side by side with wildlife. That's why we still see that. So, but there is artisanal harvesting of wildlife going on, but I would subscribe that to increased desperation and lost revenues or livelihood systems due to COVID.
Great. We got another question about actually US aid policy on indigenous peoples and the use of free, prior, informed consent. Chris and Basilia, what provisions are the Namibia conservancies using to make sure that as you work with conservancy communities, that at-risk communities have a strong and consistent say in the direction the conservancies are going?
I can start off and Basilia may add in, but David, I think one of the interesting things about the conservancy movement is it's demand driven. And conservancies are not imposed upon communities. Communities have to go through a number of extensive steps that are time consuming and demanding. And they do this because they've made the choice that they want to live with wildlife because of cultural reasons, because of heritage reasons, because of economic and livelihood reasons. And so we're in a position where we're working with communities that are very informed and very engaged. We are not telling them what to do. We are supporting them in what they want to do. That being said, there are checks and balances. So if something does happen, there are grievance approaches where communities can come forth, make a claim, have it investigated, and ensure that their voice is heard if they feel there's something unjust or inequitable that they're exposed to. I don't know if Basilia wants to add anything.
Thank you, Chris. I think you have covered it all, and just want to add on that the whole thing of conservancy movement or the community conservation movement in Namibia is really, they're community driven, and that there is actually areas that continuously wanting to be registered as conservancies purely because they really want to conserve wildlife, and they also want to derive the benefit. And also for IRDNC, we usually hold meetings at least twice a year with the communities, whereby they tell us or guide us in terms of the needs of support. So whatever support we provide or facilitation we provide to the communities is usually driven by the members saying we need support with this, we need support with respective things. Thank you.
I think this is, Chris and Basilia, I think this is really important for the participants in this session to really grasp that the Namibia Conservancy movement is a real good example of a human rights-based approach to conservation. As you say, it's demand-driven. Tom, in Northern Rangelands Trust, do your conservancies also use a grievance redress mechanism to try and make sure that marginalized elements of a community voices are heard?
David, one good thing that I like about the community conservancy model is that it's largely because it's grassroots driven. And it's one model that I've seen that donor support really hit the ground. It reaches the poor of the poorest within those communities. And the other thing that I like about the model, as I am on the ground, is the pride that these communities take by taking the credit. We normally largely tell them, we don't take credit, it's your work. We are just enabling, we're just supportive. And so there are a lot of agreements. What really gives me a lot of pride is to see the local communities on the ground being able to be accountable enough, audited, and really coming out with the clean books of accounts, really in terms of accounting every dollar. And so that gives us a lot of confidence. The more they become more independent and stable, the more our work becomes much less. But we do a lot of agreements with the communities in terms of just make sure that they get into proper structured engagement. That's why some of them are now companies, because they're now engaging into contracts and really engaging professionally. They are all not in the same space. Some of them are still young and coming up, and we're really just assisting in terms of putting systems in place to ensure that they own those systems, and we keep an eye, and so making sure that there are proper agreements and is so critical. But the communities learn very fast as long as you you enable them to learn and be a good listener to them. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, there's a lot that needs to be done. But in Africa, the future of wildlife really depends on the support from the communities.
Thanks, Tom. I did get another question in, and it's really interesting. The person noted that all of you said that external overseas development assistance, particularly in the Namibia case from the US government, was really important to the conservancy movement to get it going and to keep it moving. Could any of you, Mike and Chris, Basilia, Tom, any of you want to take a leap and provide the US government some guidance on what kind of investment would be most useful to the conservancy movement in Kenya and Namibia as you move out of, as we progressively move out of the COVID pandemic crisis? Mike, and then Chris.
Thank you. That's a very, very, very relevant question, and I would attempt. There is no one single answer, and I'm sure my colleagues will chip in. I would say part of the investment should go, in my very humble opinion, and that's the view of my organization, Conservation International, is that it should go into increasing, firstly, diversifying the livelihood opportunities on the ground. One of the lessons we've learned, and I'm sure Tom will agree, from COVID is that we learned by doing. It was almost like we had put all our eggs in one basket. A lot of communities, like I was saying earlier, relied almost 100% on ecotourism for their livelihood system. There's a community we are working with via the Northern Rangelands Trust that made nearly $300,000 in 2019. And in 2020 with COVID, they are reporting zero revenue. Now that money goes into putting food on the table, supporting the community-run health facilities, and so on and so forth. But also those communities are traditional pastoralists. So if we had managed to restore the degraded rangeland, enhance their pastoral livelihood system as another revenue stream, they could have a shock absorption, a good one. So one of the things, investments from, say, USAID or broadly the US government could go into looking into diversifying those revenue streams. Lastly, and I will shut up now, is in terms of supporting African governments to put in what they are calling stimulus packages, people should not forget community-led conservation. The fact of the matter, everybody talks about conservation tourism in Africa. You talk of Kruger National Park, you talk of Serengeti and Masai Mara and so on. But the fact of the matter is that close to 50 or 60% of all protected areas in Africa are in community hands. They are run by communities, in most cases with zero support from the national authorities. So don't forget community-led conservancies in the scheme of stimulus package, which would then go into what I said earlier, building their resilience to climate change and shocks such as this, and diversifying their revenue streams. That would be my humble suggestion.
Thanks, Mike. Chris and Basile, you've got 30 seconds.
Okay, just quickly to add on what's already been said, I do think that we need to fast track the recovery of the tourism industry. It's really been hammered, and we need to figure out how to get it back quickly for the communities to benefit. But we also learned some lessons that if we do put all our eggs in one basket and something like this happens, we're challenged. So we need to think resilience and other alternative forms of income generation. And from our side, we're thinking of something similar to carbon credits, but for wildlife credits, where we could get a willingness to pay for the existence value of wildlife as a stream of funds coming in. And maybe that helps tide us over if we have another one of these episodic events, or the 2008 economic downfall. But we need to think about and learn from our lessons. Over.
And I think that humans are remarkably imaginative. And I've been hearing people say, why don't we have virtual tourism and broadcast it in restaurants and other places in the US, like the Rainforest Restaurant, and have eco guards with cameras on their bodies, taking photographs as they go. I love the way that people really try to think imaginatively to get us out of this challenge. So thank you. That's all we have. Actually, I have time for today. I want to thank you again to all our panelists for this great conversation on community-based wildlife conservation. I'd like to thank everyone who tuned in today. We hope you join us again next Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time as we broadcast from Guatemala to provide a look into how US investments in sustainable community forest concessions in Guatemala's Maya Biosphere Reserve has helped local communities halt deforestation and achieve some of the highest incomes and lowest outmigration rates in the country. Please visit naturalsecurity.us for more information. Once again, thanks for joining us, and thanks the presenters one more time. Thank you, guys. This was really, really good. Well done.
Thank you, David.